Nothing hurts more than watching your neighbors laugh at your father's final gift. When Bjorn Ironsoul stood beside his father's grave, listening to the entire village mock his inheritance of worthless land, he felt the sting of shame that every son dreads. All he had left was a patch of moss-covered rocks and a crumbling hut. The other warriors pointed toward the distant royal fortress, reminding him of the wealth and power he'd never have. They called him a farmer now, not a fighter. But his father had buried more than just memories in that scorned earth. Hidden beneath the mud and stones was an ancient secret tied to the old gods, something that would make the mightiest kings bow down in fear. What his father left him wasn't gold or silver. It was something far more powerful. But would Bjorn be strong enough to claim his true inheritance when the time came? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants, and Bjorn Ironsoul stood at the edge of his inherited land, watching the sun struggle through the grey clouds. 3 days had passed since the burial. 3 days since the laughter had echoed across Raven's Hollow's muddy streets. The sound still rang in his ears, like the clang of sword against shield, but sharper. More cutting than any blade he'd ever faced in battle. At 6 feet and 8 inches, Bjorn cast a shadow that could cover 3 grown men, his shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world. His beard, black as a raven's wing, hung nearly to his chest, braided with small iron rings that clinked softly when he moved. The village children had always whispered that he was part giant, born of the old blood that ran through the northern lands. But giants, as every child knew, were meant to be fierce. Bjorn had never learned how to roar. His father, Gunnar Ironsoul, had been different. Where Bjorn was quiet and thoughtful, Gunnar had been thunder-made flesh. The old warrior had earned his name in the great raid against the Danish settlements, where he'd fought with such fury that his sword had been found melted to his hand after the battle. Men spoke his name in hushed tones even now. 3 years after age had finally claimed what no enemy ever could. "He left you well. That one did," came a voice from behind him. Bjorn turned to see Astrid approaching, her weathered hands carrying a wooden bowl of steaming porridge. At 72, she was the oldest woman in Raven's Hollow, and the only person who still treated Bjorn with the respect due a warrior's son. Her grey hair was bound in intricate braids that spoke of noble birth, though she'd never spoken of her family to anyone in the village. Did he? Bjorn accepted the bowl gratefully, the warmth seeping through his calloused fingers. "The others seem to think he left me nothing but rocks and shame." Astrid's pale blue eyes, sharp as winter frost, studied his face. "The others see only with their eyes, not their hearts. Your father was many things. Proud, stubborn, occasionally foolish, but he was never careless. Every choice he made carried purpose." Bjorn looked out across his inheritance. The land stretched for perhaps 2 acres, covered in thick moss that cushioned each footstep like walking on clouds. Ancient stones jutted from the earth at irregular intervals, some as tall as a man, others barely visible beneath the green carpet. The hut that sat in the center of it all leaned heavily to one side, its timber walls dark with age and moisture. "To any reasonable eye, it was worthless purpose," he repeated slowly, tasting the word like unfamiliar wine. "What purpose could there be in leaving me this when Magnus received his father's war axe? When Eric inherited 3 ships and a crew to man them? When even young Olaf was given enough silver to buy his way into the king's guard? Ah, but you're thinking like them now." Astrid settled herself on a moss-covered stone, arranging her woolen cloak around her legs. "Silver can be stolen. Ships can be sunk. Axes can be broken. But land, true land, blessed land that endures, that grows stronger with each passing season." Bjorn spooned the porridge into his mouth, savoring the taste of barley and honey. Astrid had always been generous with her meals, perhaps because she understood what it meant to be alone. Her husband had died in the same raid that made Gunnar famous, leaving her with nothing but memories and the small herb garden behind her cottage. "The warriors don't see it that way," he said. Yesterday, Magnus suggested I should sell the land to him for a handful of copper coins and use the money to buy passage south. Find yourself a merchant's life, he said. The north has no place for farmers. And what did you tell him? Nothing. Bjorn set down the empty bowl, his massive hands clenching into fists. I stood there like a mute ox and let him laugh. Just like I let them all laugh at the funeral. My father would have split his skull for such words. Your father fought his battles with steel and fury, Astrid said gently. Perhaps the gods intend for you to fight yours differently. The mention of gods stirred something in Bjorn's memory. His father had always been devout, leaving offerings at the old stones that dotted their land. Even in his final days, when fever had consumed his strength, Gunnar had insisted on dragging himself outside each dawn to whisper prayers to the ancient powers. Bjorn had thought it the rambling of a dying mind, but now he wondered if there had been method in those morning rituals. He spoke of the old ways near the end, Bjorn said. Things I didn't understand, names I'd never heard. He kept saying the land remembered, that it was waiting. I thought it was the fever talking. Astrid's expression grew distant, as if she was seeing beyond the present moment into depths of time that stretched back generations. Your father was older than most realized. His bloodline reaches back to the first settlers of this fjord, back to the days when the gods walked among men and the earth itself pulsed with their power. Perhaps he saw things that younger eyes cannot perceive. A cold wind swept across the land, carrying with it the scent of pine and salt water. The moss rippled like the surface of a green sea, and for a moment Bjorn could have sworn he heard something beneath the wind. A whisper, a sigh, the echo of ancient voices. But when he strained to listen, there was only silence. The rune stone, he said suddenly, the memory surfacing like a bubble rising from deep water. There's a stone near the hut with markings on it. Father used to sit beside it for hours, running his fingers over the carved lines. I asked him once what it meant, but he said I wasn't ready to understand. Astrid rose from her seat with the fluid grace of someone much younger. Show me. They walked together across the uneven ground, their feet making no sound on the thick moss. The stone in question stood near the northeastern corner of the property, partially hidden by a tangle of wild roses that had grown up around its base. It was perhaps 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide, its surface dark with age and weather. But carved into its face, still clearly visible after countless winters, were symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the morning light. Bjorn had seen runes. Before, every warrior could read the basic marks used for naming, weapons and claiming victories, but these were different. They flowed together like water, each symbol connected to the next in an unbroken chain that spiraled from top to bottom. There was something alive about them, something that made his fingertips tingle when he reached out to touch the ancient stone. Old magic, Astrid whispered, her voice filled with a reverence that bordered on fear. These marks predate the coming of the White Christ, predate even the worship of the All-Father. They speak of the time when the land itself was divine, when every hill and stream and standing stone housed a spirit that could be bargained with. What do they say? I cannot read them all, but this one... She pointed to a symbol near the top that looked like 2 interlocking circles. This speaks of binding. And this one, here at the bottom, marks a doorway. A passage between worlds. Bjorn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the northern wind. A doorway to where? To the realm of the gods, perhaps. Or to the deep places beneath the earth where treasures beyond imagining lie hidden. Or, her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, to the lands of the dead, where warriors feast eternal in the halls of the slain. Before Bjorn could respond, the sound of approaching hooves echoed across the fjord. A group of riders was making its way down the narrow path that led from the main village to his inherited land. Even at a distance, he could make out the gleam of mail and the bright colors of fine cloaks. These were not common farmers come to gawk at his misfortune. Trouble, Astrid murmured, though she made no move to flee. The riders numbered 6 in all, led by a man whose very presence seemed to command attention. He was perhaps 40 years of age, with golden hair that caught the sunlight and a beard trimmed in the southern fashion. His horse was a magnificent bay stallion that pranced and snorted with barely contained energy, and his saddle was worked with silver that marked him as a person of considerable wealth. But it was the banner carried by one of his companions that truly caught Bjorn's attention. The red dragon on a field of gold, the personal standard of Jarl Hakon, ruler of the coastal settlements and sworn man to the king himself. This was no casual visit. The lead rider raised his hand, bringing the group to a halt just beyond the boundary of Bjorn's land. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of one accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You are Bjorn, son of Gunnar?" He called out. "I am." Bjorn stepped forward, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of the sayaxe that hung at his side. It was not much of a weapon compared to the swords and war axes carried by the mounted men, but it had served him well in the few battles he'd fought. "I am Thorvald the Golden, herald of Jarl Hakon. My lord has sent me to speak with you regarding your recent inheritance." Something in the man's tone set Bjorn's teeth on edge. There was a smugness there, a barely concealed contempt that reminded him all too much of the laughter at his father's funeral. What interest could the Jarl have in a patch of worthless land? Thorvald's smile was thin and cold as winter ice. The Jarl is a man of great vision. He sees potential where others see only obstacles. He has authorized me to make you an offer for your property, a generous offer that would allow you to leave this place with dignity intact. How generous? Bjorn asked, though he already suspected the answer would insult him. 10 pieces of silver. Enough to buy passage to any port in the known world, with coin left over to establish yourself in whatever trade pleases you. The insult was even worse than Bjorn had imagined. 10 silver pieces would barely feed a family for a month, let alone purchase the new life Thorvald was promising. It was the sort of offer made to someone the buyer expected to be desperate, grateful for any escape from their circumstances. And if I refuse? Thorvald's expression hardened. The Jarl is not accustomed to refusal, but he is patient, particularly with those who may not fully understand their position. He gives you 3 days to consider his offer. After that, he shrugged, the gesture somehow managing to convey both indifference and threat, he may decide that your property has become a hazard to the community, something that needs to be cleared away for the common good. You threaten me on my own land. I offer you wisdom, Bjorn Ironsoul. Your father was a great warrior in his time, but his time is past. Yours has yet to begin, but only if you have the sense to recognize opportunity when it presents itself. With that, Thorvald wheeled his horse around and led his companions back toward the main path. But before they disappeared from view, one of the riders, a younger man with a scar running down the left side of his face, looked back at Bjorn with undisguised hunger. It was the look of a wolf that had caught the scent of wounded prey. Estrid waited until the sound of hooves had faded completely before speaking. "That changes things. The Jarl wants my land." Bjorn's voice was flat, emotionless. "The great lord, who has never so much as acknowledged my existence, suddenly finds my inheritance interesting enough to purchase, which means it's worth far more than anyone realizes." Astrid moved back to the rune stone, her fingers tracing the ancient symbols with newfound urgency. "The question is, what does he know that we do not?" Bjorn looked around his inherited domain with fresh eyes. The moss-covered ground, the scattered stones, the leaning hut, all of it suddenly seemed less like a burden and more like pieces of a puzzle he'd never learned to solve. His father had been many things, but he had never been careless with either his words or his possessions. If Jarl Hakon wanted this land enough to send his herald with threats barely disguised as offers, then there was indeed more here than met the eye. 3 days, he murmured. 3 days to learn what your father tried to teach you, Astrid agreed. 3 days to discover why this seemingly worthless inheritance has caught the attention of the most powerful man in the region. And 3 days to decide whether you're truly Gunnar Ironsoul's son, or just a giant who forgot how to fight. The challenge in her words stung, but it also kindled something that had been dormant in Bjorn's chest since his father's death. For the first time since the funeral, he felt the stirring of something that might have been hope, or perhaps defiance. Either way, it was better than shame. The storm came without warning on the second night, as if the gods themselves had grown tired of waiting for mortals to act. Bjorn woke to the sound of thunder rolling across the fjord, like the wheels of celestial chariots, and lightning that turned the darkness into brief, blinding day. Rain lashed against the walls of his inherited hut with such force that he feared the ancient timbers might finally surrender to time and weather. He had spent the day examining every stone, every moss-covered mound, every corner of his land, searching for some clue to explain Jarl Hakon's interest. But the earth had kept its secrets well, revealing nothing more than what any farmer might expect to find: soil, roots, and the occasional rusted iron nail from some long-forgotten construction. Now, as the storm raged outside, Bjorn sat beside the dying embers of his fire and wondered if he was chasing shadows. Perhaps his father had simply been a sentimental old man who couldn't bear to part with the land where he'd been born. Perhaps Jarl Hakon was merely an opportunist who saw a chance to expand his holdings at minimal cost. Perhaps there was nothing mysterious about any of it. The thunder crashed again, so close that the very air seemed to shatter, and in that moment of deafening sound, something else broke as well. Through the storm's fury, Bjorn heard a different kind of noise, the groan and crack of wood under stress, followed by a tremendous crash that shook the ground beneath his feet. He grabbed his cloak and pushed open the hut's door, fighting against the wind that tried to tear it from his hands. The rain struck his face like frozen needles, and he had to shield his eyes to see through the deluge. But even through the storm's chaos, he could make out what had happened. The great oak tree that had stood at the eastern edge of his property, a giant that had weathered perhaps 100 winters, lay broken across the ground. Lightning had split it cleanly down the middle, revealing the pale wood of its heart like exposed bone. But it was not the fallen tree that made Bjorn's breath catch in his throat. Where the oak's roots had torn free from the earth, a hole had opened in the ground. Not the shallow depression he might have expected, but a dark opening that seemed to descend far deeper than the root system could account for. And from that opening, barely visible through the rain, came the faintest suggestion of light. Not the warm glow of fire or candle, but something cooler, bluer, like starlight trapped beneath the earth. Bjorn approached the opening cautiously, his hand on his sayax. The hole was perhaps 3 feet across, lined with fitted stones that spoke of deliberate construction rather than natural formation. Someone, perhaps generations ago, had built a chamber beneath his land and concealed it so well that even the great tree's roots had grown around it without breaking through. The light below pulsed gently, like the breathing of some sleeping creature, and with each pulse came a sound barely audible above the storm's roar, singing, voices raised in harmony. Though the words were in no language Bjorn recognized, the melody was hauntingly beautiful, filled with longing and loss and something that might have been hope. He knelt at the edge of the opening, rain streaming from his beard, and peered into the depths. A crude ladder had been carved into the stone wall, its rungs worn smooth by countless hands over the years. The chamber below was larger than he had first thought, stretching beyond the reach of that strange, belting light. The singing grew louder, more insistent, and with it came a warmth that seemed to rise from the depths like breath from a dragon's throat. Whatever lay below had been waiting for the storm, waiting for the tree to fall, waiting for someone to find it. Bjorn thought of his father's dying words, the rambling about the land, remembering and waiting. He thought of Thorvald's threatening offer and the hunger in the scarred warrior's eyes. Most of all, he thought of the laughter at the funeral, the mockery that had followed him like a shadow since the moment he'd inherited this supposedly worthless plot. The decision made itself. Bjorn swung his legs over the edge of the opening and began his descent into the earth. The stone rungs were slick with moisture, but they held his considerable weight without complaint. As he climbed down, The strange light grew stronger, revealing more details of his surroundings. The walls were not roughly hewn, but smoothly finished, covered with the same flowing runes he'd seen on the surface stone. They seemed to move in the shifting light, writhing like living things across the ancient rock. The chamber at the bottom was vast, far larger than his hut above. Pillars of carved stone supported a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadows. And between the pillars stood objects that made Bjorn's warrior heart race with excitement and wonder. Weapons, armor, treasures beyond counting. But these were not the crude implements of mortal smiths. Every blade gleamed with inner fire, every mailshirt rippled like liquid silver, every shield bore symbols that hurt the eyes to look upon directly. This was the armory of gods, or perhaps the tomb of heroes so great that death itself had not dared to claim their possessions. In the center of the chamber stood a raised dais, and upon it rested the source of the mysterious light. It was a hammer unlike any Bjorn had ever seen, its head carved from what appeared to be a single piece of star metal that pulsed with blue-white radiance. The handle was wrapped in leather, so old it had turned black with age, but beneath the wrapping, symbols glowed with the same cold fire that emanated from the hammer's head. As Bjorn approached the dais, the singing he had heard from above resolved into something he could almost understand. Not words exactly, but meaning that bypassed his ears and spoke directly to his soul. The hammer was calling to him, recognizing something in his blood that even he had not. Known was there. He reached out with trembling fingers and grasped the handle. The world exploded into light, and sound and sensation beyond mortal comprehension. Images flooded his mind, visions of the past, the present, and futures yet to come. He saw his father as a young man, kneeling in this very chamber before an ancient figure whose face was hidden in shadows. He saw the runes on the surface stone, blazing with power, as oaths were sworn and bargains struck. He saw armies marching across the northern lands, carrying banners he did not recognize, and above them all, a darkness that threatened to swallow the world. And he saw himself, not as the quiet giant who had inherited worthless land, but as something far greater. A champion of the old gods, wielder of ancient power, guardian of secrets that could reshape the very foundations of the world. The visions faded as suddenly as they had come, leaving Bjorn gasping on the stone floor of the chamber. The hammer lay beside him, no longer glowing, looking like nothing more than an old tool left behind by some forgotten craftsman. But he could still feel its power thrumming in his bones, could still hear the echo of those ancient songs in his ears. He understood now why his father had left him this land. It was not inheritance, it was destiny. The blood of the first settlers did indeed run in his veins, and with it came responsibilities that stretched back to the dawn of time. The land had been waiting, just as his father had said, waiting for someone with the strength to claim what had been hidden, the wisdom to use what had been preserved, and the courage to face what was coming. Bjorn climbed slowly to his feet, the hammer in his hand feeling as natural as his own arm. The other treasures in the chamber called to him as well, swords that had tasted the blood of giants, armor that had turned aside the fangs of dragons, shields that had protected heroes whose names were legend, all of it waiting for someone worthy to claim it. Above, the storm still raged, but its fury no longer seemed threatening. It was celebration now, a song of triumph played by the gods themselves. The giant who had been mocked as a farmer had found his true inheritance at last. But with power came danger, and Bjorn knew that dawn would bring new challenges. Jarl Hakon would not accept refusal lightly, and there would be others, far worse than local lords with grand ambitions, who would kill for what now lay beneath his land. The quiet giant was gone. In his place stood something far more dangerous, a man with the power of gods at his command and the will to use it. Tomorrow, Raven's Hollow would learn the true meaning of his father's final gift. The singing in the chamber grew louder, welcoming him home. Dawn came pale and hesitant over Raven's Hollow, as if the sun itself feared what the storm had revealed. Bjorn stood beside the fallen oak, watching the golden light creep across his transformed land. The hammer hung at his side, disguised now as a simple tool, wrapped in rough cloth. He had learned enough in the chamber below to know that such power must be kept hidden from prying eyes. The underground armory had taken him hours to explore fully. Beyond the weapons and armor, he had discovered scrolls of parchment covered in the same flowing runes, maps that showed lands beyond the reach of any living explorer, and containers holding substances that glowed with their own inner light. Most importantly, he had found a smaller chamber containing records, the true history of his bloodline, and the oaths that bound it to powers older than memory. His great-great-grandfather had not simply been a settler, as family stories claimed. He had been a priest-king of the old religion, guardian of one of the great artifacts left behind when the gods withdrew from the world of men. The hammer was not merely a weapon. It was a key to powers that could reshape the very fabric of reality. And with the coming of the White Christ and the new ways, it had been hidden away, waiting for a time when the old balance would be needed once more. That time, according to the ancient scrolls, was now. "You look different this morning," came a familiar voice from behind him. Bjorn turned to see Astrid approaching, her sharp eyes taking in the fallen tree and the carefully concealed entrance to the chamber below. "Taller, perhaps. Or perhaps it's simply that you're finally standing straight." The storm revealed more than fallen timber, Bjorn said carefully. He trusted Astrid more than anyone in Ravenshollow, but the secrets he had discovered were dangerous enough to doom anyone who shared them unwisely. "I can see that." She gestured toward the opening, now partially hidden by broken branches. The old stories speak of such places. Halls built beneath the earth by the first settlers, repositories of power too dangerous to leave exposed to common eyes. "Your father spent many nights reading the ancient texts in my cottage. Did you think I didn't know what he was searching for?" Bjorn felt a weight lift from his shoulders. If Astrid already knew the truth, or at least part of it, then he would not have to bear this burden entirely alone. "How much do you know?" "Enough to understand why Jarl Hakon wants this land, and enough to know that selling it to him would doom more than just your family's legacy. The balance between the old powers and the new grows more precarious with each passing year. There are forces moving in the world, darkness that seeks to swallow both the Christian light and the pagan fires that came before it. When that darkness comes, the old weapons will be needed." Before Bjorn could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the fjord once more. But this time, it was a single rider, moving at a pace that spoke of urgency rather than ceremony. As the figure drew closer, Bjorn recognized young Eric Windcutter, one of the few warriors in Ravenshollow who had never joined in the mockery of his inheritance. Eric's horse was lathered with sweat and foam, as if it had been ridden hard through the night. The young warrior himself looked haggard, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by something that bordered on panic. "Bjorn," he called out as he drew rein, his voice tight with strain. "You need to hear this. There's been word from the south." Riders came in just after dawn with news from the coastal settlements. "What news?" Bjorn asked, though something in the pit of his stomach already suggested the answer would not be welcome. Ships on the horizon. Black sails flying banners nobody recognizes. They came out of the morning mist like ghosts, 50 of them or more, moving in formation like they've sailed these waters before. But that's not the worst of it. Eric paused to catch his breath, and in that moment of silence, Bjorn could hear the echo of the visions he had experienced in the chamber below. Armies marching under unknown banners, darkness that threatened to swallow the world. The need for ancient weapons to be raised once more. "Tell me," he said quietly. The first settlement they reached was Grimsby, about 20 miles down the coast. By the time the warning riders escaped, the entire village was... Eric swallowed hard, his face pale as winter ice. There was nothing left. No bodies, no ruins, just empty ground where buildings used to stand. As if the place had never existed at all. Astrid made a sound that might have been a prayer or a curse in the old tongue. "The Void Walkers," she whispered. "After all these centuries, they've finally returned." Bjorn's hand moved instinctively to the disguised hammer at his side. The weapon seemed to pulse with warmth at his touch, as if responding to the nearness of the enemy it had been forged to fight. The visions made terrible sense now. This was the darkness he had seen threatening the world, and these were the forces that would require the old powers to stand against them. Voidwalkers? Eric looked between Bjorn and Astrid, with confusion plain on his face. What are Voidwalkers? Creatures from the spaces between worlds, Astrid explained, her voice heavy with the weight of old knowledge. They feed on reality itself, consuming not just life, but the very memory of what they destroy. In the ancient days, they nearly succeeded in unmaking all creation before the gods and heroes drove them back to the emptiness beyond the world's edge. But that's just legend, Eric protested. Stories told to frighten children. All legends contain seeds of truth, Bjorn said, his own voice carrying a new certainty that surprised him. The knowledge from the chamber was settling into his mind like sediment after a flood, bringing with it understanding of things he had never consciously learned. How long before they reach Raven's Hollow? At the speed they were moving, perhaps 2 days. Maybe less if they don't pause to do whatever they did to Grimsby. Eric's hands shook slightly as he spoke. Jarl Hakon has called for all able warriors to gather at his fortress. He's planning to make a stand there, behind stone walls with trained fighters. Bjorn looked at his land, his true inheritance, and felt the weight of decisions settling on his shoulders. He could flee with the others, abandoning the ancient secrets to whatever fate awaited them. He could try to fight alongside Jarl Hakon's warriors, pretending to be nothing more than another sword arm in a desperate battle. Or he could embrace what he had discovered in the depths below and stand as his ancestors had stood, guardian of powers that could turn the tide of darkness. Send word to the Jarl, he said finally. Tell him Bjorn Ironsoul will not be joining his retreat to the fortress. What? Eric stared at him, as if he had lost his mind. You're going to stay here, alone? Against creatures that can unmake entire villages. Not alone, Astrid said quietly. The land remembers its guardians, and the old oaths still bind. If Bjorn chooses to stand, he will not stand without power. Bjorn met her eyes and saw understanding pass between them. She knew what he had found, knew what he had become, and more than that, she approved. For the first time since his father's death, Bjorn felt the stirring of something that went beyond hope or defiance. He felt ready. Eric rode hard toward the fortress, his message burning in his mind like a brand, while Bjorn and Astrid descended once more into the hidden chamber beneath the fallen oak. The blue-white light of the ancient artifacts seemed brighter now, as if responding to the approaching threat with awakened purpose. "Show me everything," Astrid said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "If we are to stand against the Void Walkers, I need to understand what tools your ancestors left for such a battle." Bjorn led her through the armory, watching as her weathered hands traced the runes carved into weapon hilts and armor plates. She paused before a particular sword, whose blade seemed to drink in the chamber's light, leaving ripples of darkness in its wake. "Shadowbane," she whispered, recognition dawning in her pale eyes. "I have read of this weapon in the oldest texts. It was forged from the heart of a fallen star and quenched in the tears of the world tree itself. Your great-great-grandfather wielded it in the last great battle against the Void, when the darkness nearly consumed all the northern lands." "You speak as if you were there," Bjorn observed, studying her face in the shifting light. There was something in her expression, a depth of knowledge that went beyond scholarly study. Astrid smiled, and for a moment her weathered features seemed to shimmer, revealing hints of something far older and more beautiful beneath the mask of mortal flesh. "Perhaps I was, in a manner of speaking. The old blood runs in many lines, Bjorn Ironsoul, and not all who serve the ancient powers are entirely human." Before he could process the full implications of her words, a new voice echoed through the chamber, deep, resonant, speaking in the old tongue with the weight of absolute authority. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, as if the stones themselves were speaking. The air has awakened the sacred weapons. The guardian bloodline stands ready once more. Bjorn spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but found only shadows dancing between the carved pillars. The hammer at his side grew warm against his leg, and suddenly he could understand the ancient words as clearly as if they were spoken in his native tongue. "Who speaks?" He called out, his voice echoing strangely in the vast space. "I am the memory of those who came before," the voice replied. The echo of oaths sworn when the world was young and the darkness first stirred in the spaces between stars. "You carry the blood of kings and the soul of guardians. Will you take up the burden your ancestors bore?" Astrid knelt suddenly, her head bowed in reverence. "The ancestor spirit," she breathed. "The collective consciousness of all who have guarded this place. I had hoped it might still linger, but I feared the long years of silence had finally claimed it." The presence in the chamber grew stronger, more focused, and with it came a pressure that made the air itself seem thick as honey. The Void Walkers return with greater strength than before. They have learned from their previous defeat, adapted their essence to resist the old weapons. But the blood of the first guardians runs true, and new power can be awakened in the ancient tools. A section of the chamber wall that had appeared solid suddenly shimmered and became transparent, revealing another room beyond. Within it stood a forge unlike any Bjorn had ever imagined, not built for working iron or steel, but for shaping reality itself. The anvil was carved from a single piece of crystallized starlight, and the hammer that lay beside it hummed with the rhythm of cosmic winds. "The forge of making," the ancestor spirit intoned. "Here your forebears shaped not just weapons, but destinies. Here the first binding was wrought that keeps the darkness at bay. And here you must prepare for what is to come." Bjorn approached the forge with reverence bordering on fear. Even standing near it, he could feel power radiating from its crystalline surface, like heat from a summer fire. The hammer on the anvil called to him, and when he lifted it, images flooded his mind, visions of cosmic forces being bent to mortal will, of metal and spirit being fused into tools, of unimaginable potency. "What must I forge?" he asked. "Not forge, but reforge," came the reply. "The weapons of your bloodline must be awakened to their full power. The hammer you carry, the sword called Shadowbane, the armor of the Guardian Kings, all were made to evolve, to grow stronger as the need grew greater. The Void Walkers you face now are not the same as those your ancestors defeated. They have consumed the essence of 1,000 worlds since their last defeat, grown vast and terrible in their hunger. Only weapons of equal evolution can stand against them." Astrid rose from her knees, her face glowing with reflected light from the forge. "The ritual of awakening requires sacrifice," she said quietly. "Not of life, but of the old self. To become what you must be, you must let go of who you were." Bjorn understood. The quiet giant who had stood silent while others mocked him, who had accepted shame as his birthright, that man had to die. In his place must rise something harder, stronger, more terrible than any enemy could imagine. The transformation had already begun when he first grasped the hammer in the depths below. Now it must be completed. He placed his hand on the crystalline anvil, feeling its surface warm beneath his palm. "Tell me what I must do." The chamber filled with light so brilliant it seemed solid, and in that radiance Bjorn saw the true scope of what he was inheriting. Not just weapons and armor, but knowledge that spanned millennia. The memories of every guardian who had come before, their victories and failures, their wisdom and their warnings. He saw the first invasion of the Void Walkers, when brave men and women had stood against impossible odds to preserve the very concept of existence. He saw his great-great-grandfather's final battle, fighting not just for territory or treasure, but for the right of reality itself to continue. He saw the price that victory had demanded. Heroes consumed by the very powers they wielded, entire bloodlines sacrificed to maintain the binding that held the darkness at bay. And he saw what was coming now. Ships that sailed not on water, but on emptiness itself, carrying warriors whose very presence unraveled the fabric of the world. a hunger so vast and patient that it had spent centuries growing stronger, while the Guardians grew complacent and forgot their purpose. But he also saw hope. The ancient weapons could be awakened, the bloodlines could be renewed, the battle could be won, if the Guardian was willing to pay the price. "I understand," Bjorn said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was accepting. "Begin the awakening." The forge of making blazed to life, and in its fire, the future of the world would be decided. The awakening was not gentle. Fire that burned without consuming flesh coursed through Bjorn's veins as the forge of making worked its ancient magic. The hammer in his hand grew heavy as a mountain, then light as a feather, its essence merging with his own, until he could no longer tell where the weapon ended and his soul began. Around him, the other artifacts in the chamber began to resonate in harmony, their combined power building toward something that had not been felt in the world for over 200 years. Astrid watched from the edge of the forge light, her mortal disguise finally falling away completely. She stood revealed as she truly was, tall and terrible in her beauty, with hair like spun silver and eyes that held the depth of winter storms. Her true nature blazed forth like a star given human form, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that touched realms beyond mortal hearing. "I am Astrid Skywatcher, last of the Valkyrie-born, chosen of the All-Father to watch over the Guardian bloodlines until their time of greatest need." The confession came like a mountain avalanche, reshaping everything Bjorn thought he had understood about his quiet village life. "I have waited 70 years for this moment, maintained my vigil through seasons of peace, while the darkness gathered its strength in the spaces between worlds." The revelation should have shocked him, but somehow it felt as natural as breathing. The awakening process was changing more than just his connection to the ancient weapons. It was opening his awareness to truths that had always surrounded him, hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life. "How many others know?" he asked, his voice strained as another wave of transformative power washed through his body. "None in Raven's Hollow suspect my true nature, though your father guessed near the end. The bloodline always recognizes its guardians, even when the conscious mind refuses to accept what it sees." She moved closer to the forge, unafraid of energies that would have reduced a normal human to ash. "But there are others stirring now. The awakening of the Guardian weapon sends ripples through both light and shadow. Our enemies will sense what is happening here." As if summoned by her words, a tremor ran through the earth above them. Not the rumble of thunder or the crack of shifting stone, but something far more ominous, the sensation of reality itself being torn like fabric. "They come sooner than expected," the ancestor spirit intoned, its voice heavy with grim satisfaction. The Voidwalkers sense the awakening and move to prevent it, but they underestimate how much power can be channeled in desperation. Through the chamber's stone ceiling, Bjorn could hear sounds that no earthly threat could make. The whisper of wind that blew from no direction, carrying voices that spoke words in languages that predated human speech. The scrape and scratch of things moving that had no solid form, leaving marks on reality itself rather than on any material surface. "The ritual must be completed," Astrid said urgently. "Half awakened, the weapons are more dangerous to their wielder than to the enemy. You must accept the full transformation or risk being consumed by powers you cannot control." Bjorn gripped the crystalline anvil with both hands, feeling the forge of making respond to his determination. "Then finish what we started." The chamber exploded into chaos as the Voidwalkers above began their assault in earnest. Cracks appeared in the stone walls, but these were not simple fractures. They were rifts in the fundamental structure of existence, gaps through which emptiness itself could seep like poison. Through these wounds in reality, shapes began to emerge that hurt the eye to look upon directly. They were not quite shadow and not quite light, but something that existed in the spaces between concepts, feeding on the absence of meaning itself. The first Voidwalker to fully manifest dropped through the ceiling like a falling star made of hunger and negation. Where it touched the chamber floor, the ancient stones began to fade, not destroyed but simply ceasing to exist, as if they had never been carved at all. Astrid moved to intercept the creature, her form blazing with Valkyrie fire as she drew a sword that seemed to be forged from crystallized battle song. The blade met the Voidwalker's essence with a sound like reality screaming, and for a moment the two forces held each other in perfect, terrible balance. But more were coming. Through the widening cracks, Bjorn could see a dozen of the hunger-shaped things descending toward the chamber. The ritual was only half complete. The weapons were awakening, but not yet bonded to his soul. In their current state, they were as likely to tear him apart as to serve his will. "I need more time," he shouted over the rising sound of cosmic winds and existential warfare. "Time is the one thing we lack," Astrid replied, her sword weaving patterns of light that temporarily sealed one of the reality rifts. "You must choose. Complete the awakening despite the risk, or flee while you still can and hope to finish the process elsewhere." The decision crystallized in Bjorn's mind with perfect clarity. His father had not hidden these weapons for his son to carry them to safety. The Guardian bloodline had not maintained its vigil for centuries, so that its heir could run when the darkness finally returned. The land itself, this patch of supposedly worthless moss and stone, had been shaped and blessed to serve as a battleground where the old powers could make their stand. "I choose to stand," he declared, and drove his fist down onto the crystalline anvil with all his strength. The impact sent shockwaves through dimensions that mortal science had no names for. The Forge of Making responded by pouring every fragment of stored power into his mortal frame, completing in seconds a transformation that should have taken days. The hammer in his other hand blazed like a captive star, and suddenly Bjorn could see the true nature of the threat they faced. The Voidwalkers were not simply destroyers. They were the living embodiment of entropy itself, the universal force that sought to return all complexity to simple nothingness. They had learned to weaponize the very concept of ending, turning their hunger into a force that could unmake not just matter and energy, but thought and memory and possibility itself. But the weapons of the Guardians had been forged to counter exactly this threat. They were tools of creation rather than destruction, devices that could impose order on chaos and meaning on emptiness. In the right hands, wielded with the proper will, they could literally rewrite the laws of existence within their sphere of influence. Bjorn rose from the forge transformed, no longer the quiet giant who had endured mockery with patient silence. Power coursed through him like molten gold, and when he spoke, his words carried the authority of someone who had touched the fundamental forces that shaped reality. "Come then, creatures of the void," he called to the descending darkness. "Learn why the ancient guardians were feared even by gods." The battle in the chamber was unlike anything in mortal memory. Bjorn wielded the awakened hammer with newfound mastery, each strike sending ripples of creative force through the air that restored sections of reality the Voidwalkers had begun to unravel. Where his weapons struck their essence, existence reasserted itself with violent brightness, forcing the creatures of emptiness to recoil like shadows fleeing dawn. But for every Voidwalker that Astrid's blade banished, or Bjorn's hammer unmade, two more seemed to seep through the widening cracks in the world's foundation. The ancient chamber, built to withstand the pressure of cosmic forces, groaned under the strain of hosting a battle between fundamental opposites. "We cannot hold them here," Astrid called out, her Valkyrie fire blazing brighter as she carved through a cluster of the hunger-shaped things. "The chamber was designed to hide power, not unleash it. We need open ground where the full strength of the Guardian weapons can manifest." Bjorn drove his hammer into the crystalline anvil one final time, and the Forge of Making responded by releasing every remaining fragment of stored energy in a single, catastrophic pulse. The wave of creative force swept through the chamber like a tsunami of pure possibility, temporarily sealing the reality rifts and forcing the surviving Voidwalkers to retreat into the spaces between moments. "The surface," he agreed, grabbing Shadowbane from its resting place among the other artifacts. The blade hummed with anticipation as it recognized its wielder, eager for the taste of battle after centuries of dormancy. But first, I need to understand what we're truly facing. He pressed his hand against one of the ancient scrolls, and knowledge flowed into his mind like water filling a vessel. The images that came were terrifying in their scope. Not just the 50 ships that Eric had reported, but hundreds more following in their wake. The Voidwalkers had not come simply to raid or conquer. They had come to begin the final unmaking, to reduce the northern lands to nothingness as a prelude to consuming all of creation. But there was something else in the visions, something that filled him with hope, even as it revealed the magnitude of the threat. Other Guardian bloodlines were stirring across the known world. In distant lands, other weapons were awakening, other heirs were discovering their true inheritance. The darkness had grown strong during the centuries of peace, but so had the light, hidden and patient, and preparing for this moment. The network of watchers, Astrid said, reading the understanding in his eyes. Your father was part of it, as was his father before him. We are not alone in this fight, though we may be the first to face it. They climbed from the chamber into a world transformed by war. The sky above Raven's Hollow had taken on a sickly grey-green colour, shot through with veins of absolute darkness where the Voidwalker's presence was strongest. The very air felt thin, as if reality itself was being slowly drained away, like water from a cracked vessel. In the distance, toward the coast, Bjorn could see the source of the corruption. Black ships that sailed on waves of nothingness, their hulls formed from crystallized emptiness and their sails woven from the absence of hope. They moved inland with impossible grace, leaving trails of unmaking in their wake where the fjord had been reduced to blank, grey void. But it was what emerged from those ships that truly tested his newfound courage. The Voidwalkers he had fought in the chamber were scouts, minor fragments of the greater darkness. What came ashore now were the true hunters, beings of such concentrated negation that their very presence began to erase the landscape around them. Where they walked, the grass didn't wither and die. It simply ceased to have ever existed. The heralds of ending, Astrid breathed, her face pale despite the Valkyrie fire that still surrounded her. I had hoped we would have more time before they deployed such forces. Bjorn raised the hammer, feeling its power respond to his need. The weapon had grown during the awakening, becoming not just a tool of creation, but a focus for his will made manifest. Through it, he could sense the ebb and flow of reality itself, the places where existence grew thin and the spaces where it could be reinforced. Time for what? To gather the other Guardians, to wake the sleeping powers scattered across the northern lands, to prepare the great binding that might hold such darkness at bay. She pointed toward the approaching heralds, and Bjorn could see that she was right to be concerned. There were dozens of them, each one a walking catastrophe that left trails of non-existence in its wake. Then we make the time we need, Bjorn said, and stepped forward to meet the approaching darkness. His first strike with the awakened hammer sent a shockwave of creative force across the landscape, temporarily halting the advance of the nearest herald. Where the power touched ground that had been partially unmade, new grass sprang up, new stones formed from crystallized possibility, new trees grew from seeds of pure potential. For a moment, the grey void was pushed back, revealing glimpses of what the land had been before the corruption began. But the effort required was immense, far beyond what any single Guardian could sustain for long. Bjorn staggered, feeling the weight of cosmic forces settling on his shoulders like a mountain made of responsibility. I can hold them, he gasped, already raising the hammer for another strike. But not forever. How long do you need to contact the other Watchers? Astrid drew forth an artifact Bjorn had not seen before, a horn carved from some impossible material that seemed to contain entire starfields within its spiraling structure. When she raised it to her lips, the sound that emerged was not heard so much as felt, a vibration that traveled not through air, but through the fundamental structure of reality itself. The Horn of Calling, she said as the cosmic note faded. Every guardian bloodline will hear it, no matter how far they may be. But whether they can reach us in time, she shook her head, uncertainty written clearly on her ageless features. The heralds of ending had recovered from Bjorn's attack and were advancing again, their forms rippling with hunger as they sensed the power radiating from the awakened weapons. Behind them, more of the black ships were arriving, disgorging forces that made the air itself scream in protest at their presence. "Then we hold until they arrive," Bjorn said simply. "This is what we were born for." He raised both hammer and sword, feeling the weight of centuries settle into his bones as the true battle began. The battle raged for what felt like hours, though time itself had become unreliable in the presence of so much concentrated void essence. Bjorn's hammer struck again and again, each blow carving temporary islands of existence from the growing sea of nothingness, while Astrid's blade wove barriers of light that held back the lesser void walkers. But they were losing ground with every passing moment. The heralds of ending had adapted to the guardian weapons faster than expected, their forms shifting and flowing to avoid the worst of the creative force while pressing their advance with relentless patience. Where Bjorn's power touched them directly, they simply dispersed like smoke, only to reform moments later from the ambient darkness that surrounded them. "We need to fall back to the secondary defenses," Astrid called out, her Valkyrie fire beginning to dim from the sustained effort. "The land itself has been blessed by generations of guardians. It will fight alongside us." But as they retreated toward the ancient stone circle that marked the true heart of Bjorn's inheritance, a new sound cut through the chaos of battle, the thunder of approaching hooves, but different somehow, heavier, more purposeful, and coming from the direction of Jarl Hakon's fortress, rather than from the corrupted coastline. Through the swirling grey mist that marked the boundary between existence and void, riders emerged at full gallop. But these were not the scattered survivors Bjorn had expected to see fleeing the Jarl's stronghold. They rode in perfect formation, their weapons gleaming with an inner light that pushed back the encroaching darkness. At their head rode a figure that made Bjorn's breath catch in his throat, Jarl Hakon himself, but transformed beyond recognition. Gone was the merely mortal lord who had sent threatening messengers. In his place rode something that blazed with divine authority, his golden hair now literally aflame with power, his armor carved from what appeared to be crystallized sunlight. In his hands he carried a spear that hummed with the voice of storm winds, and when he spoke, his words carried harmonics that touched the very foundations of the world. "Forgive the deception. Young guardian," the Jarl called out as his riders took positions around the embattled pair. "But some truths are too dangerous to reveal until the moment of greatest need." Bjorn staggered, the revelation hitting him harder than any Voidwalker's assault. "You knew! All this time you knew what I was, what this land contained. I am Hakon Lightbringer, last son of the Aesir, sent to watch over the northern realms until the darkness should return." The confession reshaped everything Bjorn thought he had understood about his situation. "My fortress was never meant to be a refuge. It was a staging ground, a place to gather forces while the true battleground prepared itself. The riders with him were not mortal warriors either," Bjorn realized with growing amazement. Each one blazed with inner fire, their weapons singing with harmonies that spoke of divine forges and cosmic purposes. These were the Einherjar, the chosen slain, warriors elevated beyond death to serve in the final battles that would determine the fate of all existence. "The threatening offer," Bjorn said, understanding flooding through him like a tide. "You needed me to refuse, needed me to stay here and discover my inheritance." "A guardian cannot be commanded to his destiny," Hakon agreed, his spear carving through a herald of ending with casual efficiency. "He must choose it freely, or the weapons will not accept him. Your father understood this when he asked me to play the role of antagonist. Sometimes a young eagle needs to be pushed from the nest to remember it has wings." Astrid moved to join them, her Valkyrie nature recognizing its divine kin. The deception was necessary but risky. If Bjorn had chosen to sell the land or fled rather than stand and fight, Then the darkness would have won decades ago when his father first made his bargain with the ancient powers, Hakon said. The bloodline chooses its own path, but it has never chosen wrong when the need was greatest. Around them, the tide of battle was shifting. With the arrival of the Einherjar, the Voidwalkers found themselves facing not just guardian weapons, but divine fury made manifest. Spears of crystallized starlight pierced the hearts of heralds of ending. Swords that sang with the voices of falling warriors carved through reality tears to seal them with threads of pure meaning. But even as they fought, Bjorn could sense something wrong in the very fabric of the battle. The Voidwalkers were not fighting with the desperate fury of creatures facing extinction. They were fighting a holding action, keeping the Guardians occupied, while something else, something far more dangerous, moved into position. This is not their main assault, he realized aloud, the understanding striking him like a physical blow. They're buying time. Hakon's expression grew grim. Time for what? The answer came not in words, but in a sensation that made reality itself seem to stagger. Somewhere to the north, beyond the range of mortal sight but clear to those touched by divine power, something vast and hungry was stirring. Not another herald, or even a fleet of void ships, but the source from which all such lesser threats emanated. The Void Heart, Astrid whispered, her face pale as winter snow. The original tear in creation, from which all other Voidwalkers are born. It's moving. Through the chaos of battle, images flashed through Bjorn's consciousness, visions shared by the awakened weapons themselves. A wound in the fabric of existence, so ancient and deep that it predated the formation of stars. A hunger so vast that it had been consuming alternate realities for eons, growing stronger with each universe it devoured. And now, finally, it had found its way to their reality, drawn by the scent of the guardian weapons awakening. How long? Hakon demanded. Hours at most, Astrid replied. When it arrives, these local incursions will seem like gentle rain compared to the hurricane that follows. Bjorn felt the weight of cosmic responsibility settling on his shoulders like a cloak made of lead. The battle they were fighting now, this desperate stand against heralds and void ships, had never been the real test. It had been preparation, a chance for him to master his inherited powers before facing something that could unmake entire star systems with a thought. The other Guardians, he said. Your horn call will bring them, but not quickly enough. The Void Heart moves faster than any mortal travel, and it will be here before dawn. Astrid's voice carried the weight of terrible certainty. We will face it with the forces we have now, or not at all. Hakon nodded grimly, his divine nature radiating grim determination. Then we make our stand here, on ground blessed by generations of guardians, with weapons forged in the dawn of time. If we fall, let it be said that we fell facing the darkness rather than running from it. But Bjorn was not listening to the words of preparation and resolve. He was hearing something else, a whisper that came not from any external source, but from deep within his own transformed soul. The awakening process had changed more than just his connection to the guardian weapons. It had opened pathways in his mind that led to knowledge he had never consciously acquired. Knowledge of a weapon that had been hidden even from the Void Heart's awareness. Something so dangerous that even the ancient guardians had hesitated to create it. So powerful that its very existence had been erased from all records, save those written in the deepest chambers of the mind. There is another way, he said quietly, and both Hakon and Astrid turned to stare at him with expressions of mingled hope and terror. What way? Hakon asked. Bjorn looked toward the hidden chamber beneath the fallen oak, where secrets deeper than the forge of making waited in darkness. My great-great-grandfather didn't just hide weapons down there. He hid something else, something that was never meant to be used unless creation itself hung in the balance. What are you talking about? The unmaking blade, Bjorn whispered, and even speaking the name aloud seemed to darken the air around them. A weapon forged not to create or preserve, but to cut through the fundamental bonds that hold reality together. It was designed to wound the Void Heart itself, but using it would require a sacrifice beyond anything the ancient guardians were willing to pay. Astrid's eyes widened with understanding and horror. The wielder's life, and more than life. The wielder's very existence, erased from past, present, and future. Not death, complete negation, but if it worked, Bjorn said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was contemplating. It would wound the void heart so deeply that it would retreat to the spaces between realities, not to return for another 1,000 years. Around them, the battle continued, but somehow it seemed distant now, like the echo of thunder from a storm that had already passed. The real choice was not whether to fight or flee, but whether to sacrifice. Everything for a chance, just a chance, to save the world from a darkness that would otherwise consume everything. Bjorn looked at his inheritance one last time, the land that had made him a laughingstock, the power that had made him a guardian, the destiny that might make him a hero whose name would never be remembered. I know what I have to do, he said. The descent into the deepest chamber beneath his land felt like a journey through the layers of time itself. Bjorn moved through passages he had not noticed during his first exploration, guided now by knowledge that whispered in his transformed mind. Behind him came Hakon and Astrid, their divine natures radiating enough light to push back the shadows that seemed to reach for them with hungry fingers. "Are you certain of this path?" Hakon asked, his voice heavy with the weight of ages. "Once you take up the unmaking blade, there will be no turning back. The weapon chooses its moment of use, not its wielder." "I understand the price," Bjorn replied, though his hands trembled as he pressed them against the wall that concealed the final chamber. "Better that one man be forgotten than all of creation be consumed." The stone responded to his touch, recognizing the awakened power that flowed through his veins. What had appeared to be solid rock melted away like ice before flame, revealing a space that hurt to look at directly. This was not a chamber built by mortal hands, but a wound in reality itself, carefully controlled and shaped to contain something that should never have been allowed to exist. In the center of that impossible space, suspended above an abyss that seemed to fall through infinite dimensions, hung a blade that was simultaneously the most beautiful and most terrifying thing Bjorn had ever beheld. It was not forged from any material that existed in the natural world. It was made from crystallized contradiction, shaped from the spaces between thoughts, tempered in the fires of things that had never been born. The unmaking blade did not reflect light so much as devour it, creating patterns of darkness that moved with hypnotic grace across its surface. To look at it was to understand, on a level deeper than conscious thought, what it meant for something to truly not exist. Not to die, not to be destroyed, but to have never been at all. "The final work of the first Guardian Kings," Astrid whispered, her Valkyrie nature recoiling from the weapon's presence even as she recognized its terrible necessity. They created it in desperation when they realized that some threats could not be fought with creation alone. Sometimes the only way to preserve existence is to master the forces of non-existence. Bjorn reached out toward the blade, then stopped. Already he could feel its influence seeping into his mind, showing him visions of what would happen when he grasped its hilt. The weapon would not simply erase him when it struck the void heart, it would unravel his entire timeline, making it so that he had never been born, never lived, never made the choices that led him to this moment. His parents would remember having a different child, or no child at all. The villagers who had mocked him would find themselves unable to recall what they had been laughing about. Astrid would remember watching over a different bloodline, or perhaps no bloodline at all. The very land above would reshape itself as if a different inheritor had claimed it. "There has to be another way," he said, his voice barely audible in the strange acoustics of the impossible chamber. "There is," came a voice from behind them, and they turned to see a figure emerging from shadows that had not been there moments before. It was Eric, but changed beyond recognition. His young features had aged decades in the span of hours. His eyes, now holding depths of sorrow that spoke of terrible knowledge gained too quickly. "Eric?" Bjorn stared at his friend in confusion. "How did you find this place?" "Because I am not who you think I am," Eric replied, his form beginning to shimmer and shift like heat haze above summer stones. "I am the last guardian of the eastern reaches, heir to weapons as ancient as your own. My true name is Erica Truthseeker, and I have been waiting my entire life for this moment." The revelation hit Bjorn like a physical blow. Another deception. Not deception, protection. "The network of watchers extends further than you know, Bjorn Ironsoul. Every major bloodline has placed guardians in the settlements surrounding the ancient weapon caches. We have watched over each other across generations, waiting for the time when all the powers would need to awaken at once." Erica reached into the shifting shadows around him and drew forth a blade that sang with harmonies of pure truth. Where the unmaking blade devoured light and meaning, this weapon seemed to clarify them, cutting through illusion and falsehood with surgical precision. "The blade of absolute truth," Hakon breathed, recognition dawning in his divine features. "I thought it was lost when the eastern kingdoms fell. Hidden, not lost. Preserved for this moment." Erica stepped closer to the suspended unmaking blade, his weapon held ready. "There is indeed another way, but it requires perfect coordination between two guardian weapons and absolute trust between their wielders." Astrid's eyes widened as understanding flooded through her. "The binding of opposites. Create and unmake, working in perfect harmony to achieve what neither could accomplish alone." "Explain," Bjorn demanded, though part of him already understood the terrible elegance of what was being proposed. "The unmaking blade can wound the void heart, but not without unraveling the wielder's existence," Erica said. "But if, at the precise moment of contact, the blade of truth cuts through the connection between weapon and wielder, the unmaking can be contained. The wound still occurs, but the price is shared between two bloodlines instead of erasing one completely." "Shared how?" "We both live, but we both die. We exist, but we are forgotten. We become living ghosts, present in the world but absent from all memory and record. The ultimate sacrifice, not death, but irrelevance." Hakon shook his head grimly. "The risk is enormous. If the timing is off by even a heartbeat, both guardians could be unmade completely. And even if it succeeds, you would spend the rest of your lives watching the world you saved forget that you ever existed." "But the world would survive," Bjorn said quietly. "And that is what matters." Above them, the sounds of battle were growing more desperate. The Void Walkers were pressing their attack with renewed fury, knowing that their master's arrival was imminent. Through the layers of stone and earth, Bjorn could feel the approaching presence of the Void Heart like a weight settling on his soul. The ancient evil was perhaps an hour away now, maybe less. "We need to decide quickly," Astrid urged. "The longer we delay, the stronger the Void Heart becomes. It feeds on the chaos of battle, growing more powerful with each moment that passes." Bjorn looked at Erica, his friend, his fellow guardian, perhaps the only person in the world who could truly understand what they were contemplating. "You would do this? Give up not just your life, but your very place in the world's memory?" "I've been preparing for this moment since I was old enough to understand what my bloodline meant," Erica replied. "Every guardian knows that the ultimate service may require ultimate sacrifice. At least this way, we face it together." The decision crystallized in Bjorn's mind with the same clarity he had felt when choosing to stand against the Jarl's threats. This was what he had been born for, not glory or recognition, but the chance to preserve something infinitely more valuable than his own existence. "Then we do this together," he said, and reached for the unmaking blade. The weapon's hilt felt like grasping liquid ice that burned without producing heat. The moment his fingers closed around it, visions of non-existence flooded his mind, images of realities that had never been, people who had never lived, possibilities that had been strangled before they could draw breath. The blade wanted to be used, hungered to fulfill its purpose of selective destruction. Erika raised the blade of truth, its song harmonizing strangely with the silent scream of its opposite. When the moment comes, I will cut the connection between you and the unmaking. The backlash will claim us both, but in a different way. Are you ready? As ready as anyone can be for something like this, Bjorn replied. Surprised by the steadiness of his own voice, they began the ascent back toward the surface, leaving Hakon and Astrid to follow at a safe distance. The two blades created a field of distortion around their wielders, bending light and shadow into impossible patterns. Where they passed, the stone walls bore new carvings, runes that told the story of what was about to happen, ensuring that some record would remain, even if all memory was lost. Whatever happens, Erika said as they climbed, know that it has been an honor to stand with you. Bjorn Ironsoul, and with you, Erika Truthseeker. Above them, the storm-torn sky was beginning to darken with something far worse than natural clouds. The Void Heart was almost here, and the final battle was about to begin. They emerged into a world transformed by approaching apocalypse. The very air shimmered with potential non-existence, and the horizon had taken on the grey-green color of absolute ending. In the distance, something vast and terrible was rising from the corrupted sea, not a ship or creature, but a living wound in reality itself. The time for preparation was over. The moment of ultimate choice had arrived. The Void Heart rose from the corrupted sea like a nightmare given form, its presence causing reality to buckle and warp in concentric waves. It was not a creature in any sense that mortal minds could comprehend. It was absence made manifest, a walking wound in existence that left trails of absolute nothing in its wake. Where it moved, the very concept of having been there simply ceased. Bjorn stood at the edge of his inherited land, the unmaking blade heavy in his hands, watching as the ancient enemy of all creation approached with terrible inevitability. Around him the final battle raged with cosmic fury. Hakon's Einherjar fought desperately to hold back the lesser Voidwalkers, their divine weapons carving temporary islands of meaning from the spreading sea of nothingness. Astrid's Valkyrie fire blazed like a star against the encroaching darkness, but even her immortal strength was beginning to wane. It's larger than the old records suggested, Erika said quietly, his blade of truth singing softly as it cut through the illusions that the Void Heart cast simply by existing. The centuries of feeding have made it grow beyond what the first guardians faced. The approaching entity towered above the landscape like a mountain of crystallized hunger, its form shifting between states that had no names in any living language. Sometimes it appeared as a vast humanoid figure wrapped in shadows that moved against the light. Other times, it resembled a great tree whose branches reached into dimensions that folded back upon themselves. But always, it remained fundamentally wrong, an intrusion from the spaces between thoughts that should never have found its way into the realm of the real. The timing will be critical, Bjorn said, feeling the unmaking blade's eagerness growing stronger as its ultimate target drew near. The weapon was practically vibrating in his hands now, its crystallized contradiction resonating with the approaching presence of its perfect opposite. And we get one chance at this, I know. Erika moved to stand beside him, the two guardian weapons creating a field of distortion that made the air around them shimmer like heat haze. When you strike, I strike. When you fall, I fall. Whatever happens to us, the world remembers the deed, if not the doers. The Void Heart paused in its advance, seeming to sense the presence of weapons specifically designed to harm it. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a sound like the universe screaming in its sleep. Guardian spawn, it said, the words causing visible cracks to appear in the air itself. You carry the toys your ancestors made in their desperation. Do you think such trinkets can wound that which predates the very concept of wound? Only one way to find out, Bjorn replied, and began walking toward the entity with steady, measured steps. Behind him, the sounds of battle grew more intense as the lesser Voidwalkers sensed their master's focus shifting. But Hakon and Astrid held their ground, their combined might creating a barrier of light and divine fury that kept the path clear for the two guardians and their impossible mission. The Void Heart laughed, and the sound was like watching stars die in fast forward. You do not understand what you face, small guardian. I have consumed the light of 1,000 suns, devoured the dreams of entire species, reduced whole galaxies to the grey emptiness that existed before the first word was spoken. Your little blade of contradiction is a gnat's bite to one who has tasted the extinction of realities. Perhaps, Bjorn agreed, still walking steadily forward, even as the entity's presence began to tear at the edges of his consciousness. But gnats can carry diseases that fell giants. The distance between them was closing rapidly now. Bjorn could see details in the Void Heart's impossible structure that made his guardian-enhanced mind reel with vertigo. It was not simply large, it existed in more dimensions than physical space should allow, its form extending through layers of reality that folded back upon themselves, in patterns that hurt to contemplate. Now I understand, the Void Heart said, its voice carrying a note of something that might have been respect if such an entity were capable of emotion. You intend to use the unmaking against me, knowing that it will unmake you as well. A noble gesture, but ultimately futile. I've faced unmaking blades before, guardian spawn. Their wielders always hesitate at the crucial moment, unable to accept their own erasure. Maybe, Bjorn said, raising the weapon above his head as the entity's shadow fell across him like a living thing. But I'm not facing this alone. The Void Heart's attention shifted to Erica, and for the first time, something that might have been surprise flickered through its alien consciousness. The Blade of Truth. I had thought that particular annoyance was lost when the Eastern Kingdoms fell. Hidden, not lost, Erica replied, echoing his earlier words. Waiting for this moment. Clever. The binding of opposites. Create and unmake, working in perfect harmony. The entity's form began to shift and solidify, preparing for combat against weapons it had not faced together in over a millennium. But even if you succeed in wounding me, the cost will be your existence itself. Are you truly prepared to pay that price? Bjorn looked back one last time at the land that had been his inheritance, at the friends who had become family, at the world he was about to save by erasing himself from it. Everything he had ever known or loved would forget him the moment the blades completed their work. He would become a living ghost, present but unremembered, watching over a world that no longer knew his name. Yes, he said simply, and struck. The unmaking blade struck the Void Heart's essence with a sound like reality tearing in half. Where the weapon touched the entity's form, absolute nothingness met crystallized contradiction in a collision that sent shockwaves through dimensions that had no names. The very fabric of existence screamed as two fundamental forces, the power to unmake and the nature of never having been, found themselves locked in mortal combat. The Void Heart recoiled with something that might have been pain if such a being were capable of experiencing sensation in any recognizable form. For the first time in eons, it had been truly wounded. Not destroyed, not diminished, but cut in a way that reached to the core of its unnatural existence. Impossible! It howled, its voice cracking the air like thunder. No guardian has ever. But even as it spoke, Bjorn felt the unmaking blade's terrible price beginning to extract itself. His memories started to fray at the edges, details of his life becoming uncertain and strange. Had he truly been mocked at his father's funeral, or was that someone else's pain? Had he really stood on worthless land, dreaming of better things, or was that simply a story he had told himself? The weapon was unraveling his timeline, erasing him backwards through the years like a fire consuming a tapestry from the newest threads to the oldest. Soon there would be nothing left of Bjorn Ironsoul but the echo of a name no one would remember speaking. That was when Erica struck, the blade of truth cut through the connection between the unmaking blade and its wielder with surgical precision, severing the flow of erasure like a sword through rope. But the backlash was immediate and catastrophic. Both guardians were caught in the backlash as two cosmic forces found themselves suddenly redirected. Bjorn felt himself falling through layers of existence, his consciousness scattered across multiple dimensions as the severed connection sought new paths to complete itself. He was still himself, still aware, but something fundamental had changed. He could feel his presence in the world becoming translucent. Not gone, but somehow less real than everything around him. The void heart's wound blazed with impossible light, not the warm glow of fire or sun, but the cold radiance of absolute truth cutting through absolute falsehood. Where Erica's blade had intersected with the unmaking's work, something new had been created. A scar that could not heal because it existed in the space between existence and non-existence. "What have you done?" the entity demanded, its voice now tinged with something that sounded almost like fear. "This wound, it burns with permanence. It cannot be undone or absorbed. We've given you something to remember us by," Erica said, though his voice sounded distant and strange, as if it were coming from very far away. Like Bjorn, he had been caught in the backlash of their desperate gambit. A reminder that creation always finds a way to resist destruction. The void heart staggered backward, its massive form beginning to lose coherence around the edges. The wound was spreading, not destroying the entity, but forcing it to confront something it had never experienced before, the possibility of genuine limitation. For the first time since its birth in the spaces between realities, it faced something that could not be consumed or unmade. "This is not defeat," it snarled, its form beginning to collapse inward, like a star dying in reverse. "This is merely postponement. I will retreat to the deep void, but I will return when the wound has scarred over. And when I do, I will remember your faces, guardians. I will remember your names. No." Astrid's voice cut through the cosmic chaos, her Valkyrie fire blazing brighter than it ever had before. "You won't." She raised something Bjorn had never seen her carry, a small crystal vial that contained what looked like liquid starlight. As she spoke, she poured its contents onto the ground where the two guardians stood, and immediately the air around them began to shimmer with transformative power. "The waters of Lethe," Haken breathed in recognition. "The final gift of the All-Father to those who sacrifice beyond the call of duty. Memory's mercy for the forgotten heroes." The liquid spread across the ground in patterns that hurt to look at directly, creating a circle of power that encompassed both guardians. Where it touched, the effects of their sacrifice began to, not reverse exactly, but transform. They would still be forgotten by the world, still exist in the spaces between full reality and complete absence. But they would remember themselves, remember each other, and find purpose in their ghostly existence. "Guardian spirits," Astrid explained as the waters of Lethe completed their work. "Protectors who exist between the world of the living and the realm of legend. You will watch over the ancient sites, guide future generations when darkness threatens, and ensure that the knowledge of the old ways never completely dies." The void heart let out one final scream of frustrated hunger before collapsing into itself completely, retreating through dimensions of darkness to nurse its impossible wound. The lesser void walkers, cut off from their master's sustaining presence, simply faded away like shadows when the sun finally breaks through storm clouds. As the cosmic forces settled and reality began to reassert its proper shape, Bjorn found himself standing in a world that looked exactly the same, but felt fundamentally different. He was still there, still present, but he could already sense that when people looked at him, they would see through him without quite realizing why. "Is it over?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "This battle is over," Haken replied, his divine nature allowing him to perceive the transformed guardians clearly. "But there will be others. There are always others. The difference is that now, when darkness threatens again, it will face guardians who have already paid the ultimate price and learned that some things are worth more than existence itself." The sun broke through the dissipating clouds, painting the fjord in shades of gold and crimson. A new day was beginning for a world that had no idea how close it had come to ending. 3 months after the battle that saved the world, Bjorn stood at the edge of what had once been his inherited land, watching the sunrise paint the fjord in shades of gold and amber. The moss-covered ground looked exactly as it had before the storm revealed its secrets. The fallen oak had been cleared away, and a new hut, smaller but sturdier, had been built where the old one had crumbled. To all appearances, nothing had changed. But Bjorn knew better. The villagers of Ravenshollow went about their daily lives with no memory of cosmic battles or ancient guardians. They remembered a terrible storm that had damaged several properties, and vague stories of raiders from the south who had been driven off by Jarl Hakon's forces. The details grew hazier each day, as if the world itself were gently erasing the memory of how close it had come to ending. A young couple now lived in the hut that had once been his. Eric's sister Sigrid and her new husband, a fisherman named Olaf, who treated the land with the reverence it deserved without understanding why. They could not see Bjorn when he stood in their garden, could not hear him when he spoke. But sometimes they paused in their work as if sensing a presence, a benevolent weight, watching over their small piece of the world. "Strange," Sigrid had said to her husband just that morning, her hand resting on her slightly swollen belly. "Sometimes I feel like this place has been blessed by someone who loved it very much. Like we're being watched over by a guardian angel, perhaps." Olaf had nodded, feeling the same presence without being able to name it. The old-timers always said this land was special. Maybe that's why. Bjorn had smiled at that, taking comfort in the knowledge that some truths persisted, even when the facts that created them were forgotten. The land remembered even when its people could not. Brooding again. Came a familiar voice from behind him. Ulrika materialized from the morning mist, his form translucent in the early light, but solid enough to cast a shadow. Like Bjorn, he had adapted to their new existence between the world of the living and the realm of legend. "Thinking," Bjorn corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "You've been standing here every morning for a week, watching the same sunrise over the same fjord." Eric moved to stand beside him. Their shared nature, allowing them to interact normally, despite being invisible to the rest of the world. "Are you regretting what we did?" Bjorn considered the question seriously, as he had every day since their transformation. "No, but I'm learning what it means to be forgotten while still being present. It's harder than I expected." They watched in comfortable silence as the village came to life below them. Children ran through streets that had once been threatened with complete erasure, their laughter echoing across water that had briefly been reduced to grey void. Fishermen prepared their boats for another day of ordinary miracle, casting nets into the sea, trusting that there would be fish to catch and a shore to return to when the work was done. "Astrid says we're adapting well," Erica observed. The Valkyrie had become their link to the divine realm, able to see and speak with them despite their transformed state. "Better than most who undergo the waters of Lethe." "Most don't undergo it voluntarily," Bjorn pointed out. "Most don't get to choose their sacrifice." "True, and most don't get companions to share the burden." Erica's form solidified slightly as his mood lightened. "I've been thinking about what she told us yesterday. About the other guardian sites awakening across the northern lands." Bjorn nodded. They had felt it too, distant vibrations in the fabric of reality, as other bloodlines discovered their inheritance, other weapons stirred from their slumber. The Void Heart's defeat had sent ripples across the world, awakening powers that had slept for generations. "The network is rebuilding itself," he said. "The old Watchers are finding each other again, and we become the first link in the new chain. The guardians who guard the guardians." Erica's expression grew thoughtful. "I can think of worse fates." A new sound caught their attention, the thunder of approaching hooves, but these moved with purpose rather than urgency. Through the morning mist came riders they recognized, Hakon and a small company of his Einherjar, their divine nature allowing them to perceive the transformed guardians clearly. "Brothers," Hakon called out as he dismounted. His golden hair still touched with divine fire, but his expression warm with genuine affection. "I bring word from the other realms." "What word?" Bjorn asked. The Void Heart's retreat has been noted by powers on both sides of the cosmic balance. The forces of creation have taken heart from your victory, while the servants of entropy have grown more cautious. For the first time in centuries, the tide is turning toward the light. Hakon reached into his saddlebags and withdrew 2 items that made both guardians straighten with recognition. They were torques, neck rings of twisted gold and silver that hummed with harmonics of divine craftsmanship. But these were not merely decorative. They were badges of office, marks of rank that would be visible even to mortal eyes. The All-Father sends these with his blessing, Hakon said formally. You have proven yourselves worthy of recognition among the immortal champions. Wear these, and let all who have eyes to see know that you stand guard over the ancient ways. Bjorn accepted his talk with hands that trembled slightly despite his transformed nature. The moment the metal touched his throat, he felt a change, not in his essential being, but in how that being related to the world around him. He was still forgotten, still unseen by most, but now he could choose when to reveal himself to those who needed guidance or protection. There will be work to do, Hakon continued. Other sites to watch over, other bloodlines to guide when their time of awakening comes. The network of guardians must be stronger than it was before, more prepared for the darkness that will eventually return. We understand, Erica said, fastening his own talk with steady hands. This was never about a single battle. It was about becoming part of something larger. As the sun climbed higher, painting the fjord in brilliant gold, Bjorn felt something he had not experienced since his father's death, a sense of belonging, of purpose that went beyond his own desires or fears. He was no longer the quiet giant who had inherited worthless land. He was no longer the guardian who had been forced to choose between existence and sacrifice. He was something new, something that stood watch between the world of memory and the realm of legend, ensuring that when darkness threatened again, the light would be ready. The village below continued its peaceful morning routine, unaware that it was protected by heroes, whose names it would never remember, but whose presence would never falter. And in that ignorance lay the Guardian's greatest victory, a world so safe that it could afford to forget the price of its safety. The sun reached its zenith, and 2 guardian spirits began their eternal watch. He content in the knowledge that some gifts were worth the giving, even when the recipients could never know the giver's name.